Hey, we're here today for a conversation with NuCypher and Figment Networks. Joining us from NuCypher, we have both Maclane and Tux, and from Figment is myself, Andrew. So before I get going, I'll give a moment for Maclane and Tux if you would like to introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Maclane. I am one of the co-founders of NuCypher. My background is sort of a blend of both technology and software engineering and also traditional finance. Worked at Morgan Stanley for a couple years covering tech and media and telecommunications companies, more on like the M&A advisory and capital market side, and then moved out to the San Francisco Bay Area and got into blockchain, cryptography back in probably 2013, 2014, back when it was kind of like the pre-Ethereum days of counterparty and these sort of precursors to ETH that were built on top of Bitcoin. Built something called ZeroDB, which was an end-to-end encrypted database that was kind of an early sort of precursor to what is now the NuCypher network. And I'm involved in just a bunch of different areas of NuCypher.
Great. How about you, Tux?
Yeah, so I'm Tux. I'm a cryptography engineer at NuCypher. My background is in software engineering, mostly. I first got into crypto when I was in high school, around I think my freshman year, so around like 2010, 2011. Didn't make any money off that though, so that's the the key thing there, unlike everybody else. Other than that, I kind of hopped around after I graduated from high school. Obviously, hopped around some jobs. Eventually landed into cryptocurrency again, and joined NuCypher as one of the first engineers on the team, and have been there for 3 years since then. So I've been working on the cryptography as well as the distributed computing parts of that and everything.
Mm-hmm. Great. Good. Thanks for that. So there's 3 buckets of things we want to talk about today. We want to talk about the NuCypher DAO. We want to talk about the WorkLock, and then also some of the things that we're getting ready as we sort of get closer to Mainnet. And so before we get into those 3 topics, I'm curious if either one of you wants to take a crack at just a quick 30-second pitch for what is NuCypher and why should people be interested in it? Who's the target audience?
Sure. So NuCypher is a threshold cryptography network. So basically what that means is that it is purpose-built for, it's kind of like a middleware developer tool that other people building applications would use, as part of, their end user application. So like you and I as end users wouldn't really use NuCypher directly. We would be using it via some, other application. And sort of the main use cases is that it enables are things like access control and secrets management. And then the first sort of threshold primitive that's deployed onto the network is something called proxy re-encryption. But it's really more of a sort of general network that can support really any kind of threshold cryptographic primitive. Maybe things that we deploy or community members can easily deploy, things like Shamir secret sharing, threshold signatures, basically any kind of threshold crypto primitive. So that could support a lot of different types of use cases that way. And it's kind of like a layer 2 network on top of Ethereum, and basically consists of a bunch of nodes that are providing these threshold cryptography services that are required to stake the native NuCypher token as a way to join the network and then provide this service.
Got it. Okay, so is it fair to say that in maybe traditional software terms, this is more of a B2B type thing where end users probably won't come and use NuCypher directly, but you are probably would interact more with either developers or other people who are using this in their own application? Is that right?
Yep. So definitely a more like B2D. So business to developers is the primary audience that that would be using NuCypher.
Okay, and then of those developers, do you think that the primarily be people who are already sort of in the crypto world, or do you think that it'll be folks using this outside of that, sort of adding this as a function to a non-crypto app? Do you have any ideas about that, or anything you've seen so far?
Sure. So I mean, I think like certainly the early adopters that we've seen so far that have built a bunch of the applications that are running on the various testnets, for example, are definitely more sort of already in the crypto space. So these are people that are building like crypto native applications, dApps, other decentralized protocols, and NuCypher is just sort of one of a suite of these decentralized protocols that they're using. There's nothing like inherent to NuCypher, I guess, that means it can only ever be used by people building dApps. It could be used by a traditional centralized application, certainly. But certainly like the bulk of the early sort of adopters are definitely more crypto native.
Okay, and Tux, maybe this is a question for you. What sort of interfaces should developers expect, or what would an integration look like for them to incorporate this in their app?
Yeah, so we have a few integrations that we can go off of. We have a RESTful interface, which is the primary component. So every NuCypher node on the network has a REST interface that you interact with it. From there, we also have the NuCypher clients that we would use to interact with those nodes. And those also have an RPC interface and a REST interface that you can both use to communicate with those networks, as well as like some inter-socket connections. So if you don't want to interact via REST, you can do through the file system as well. Kind of like similar to how Geth works, or if you've ever used some of those things.
Yep.
Other than that, we also have a Python API, which is what the bulk of the entire code base is written in Python. So if you know Python, it's really easy to integrate that with those really fast and quick Python applications that way. We're also working on a bunch of different other APIs as well. We're trying to integrate and make it so you can use it from many places as well. So we have a lot of other plans other than that too.
Okay, and so if someone has an application they want to integrate with, what on the infrastructure side, what will they need to run? Will they need to run their own node, or can they use a different node that's existing, or sort of what do they need to bring to the table?
Right. So to interact with the NuCypher network, you actually don't need any. You don't need to run any NuCypher node. The only thing you actually need to run is a NuCypher client to interact with the NuCypher network, which is extremely light. We have this one process just called just node discovery. We like to call it the learning loop, but we have some other names for it. I think something like Acumen as well, that essentially goes to each node of the network and acts as sort of like a gossip protocol and learns about the network so you can interact with it. And that's the only thing that you need to do. And once you do it once, it's really easy to keep doing it again. So you can like spin it up and keep going. And it's like the bulk of like the time. So if you actually have a service that's running a NuCypher client is really simple and really, really fast. Other than that, you don't need to run an Ursula, or like what we call our node on our network, Ursula. You don't need to run one of those nodes. You need to have an Ethereum client, or at least a way to interact with Ethereum so you can pay the nodes in the network for your policies that you use the network on. And that's about it. So you can really take it as far as you want. Like you can run your own full node if you want, or you can use Infura or some other kind of client that you have. But really, NuCypher is flexible enough that you can pick and choose your infrastructure, and typically you can make it work in any sort of setting.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah, I'm always curious about the sort of interfaces and sort of the developer experiences here that we might see. And similar to that, one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was the DAO, and that's sort of a different interface. That's sort of the interface between maybe the protocol and the world. And so I'm curious of any of the design decisions or criteria when you thought about the DAO, why it needs to exist, and what you're hoping to accomplish with the DAO.
Sure. So basically, the NuCypher DAO is composed of all of the stakers in the NuCypher network. So really, like, I guess to give context, like the function of the new token is to stake and run a node. So it's not used for payments or anything like this. Basically, it's I think other people have referred to this model as like a kind of a work token. So if you want to run a node on the NuCypher network and basically earn fees from users that are paying for your services, you have to stake some amount of the new token. And then that allows you to join the network and get allocated work and earn fees and earn inflation subsidy. So basically, the reason for the DAO is that the DAO controls or owns several of the network contracts, and it also controls a certain number of network parameters. So things like the slashing penalty, what's that, like what kind of what actions are slashable offenses, the penalty for those actions, minimum and maximum sort of price ranges that a node can set, default fees. And these are all basically things that are most impactful to stakers. So obviously, if someone gets slashed, like that, is impactful to a staker. Like the amount that stakers charge is obviously very important for all of their business models. And so we thought it was very important that sort of control over those parameters ultimately rested in the hands of the people that they impact the most, which is the stakers, rather than like us as a core developer team, or even just like every token holder maybe who's just sort of passively holding the token probably shouldn't have as much sort of voice in a potential DAO or sort of governance framework. And so what the DAO does is it controls these different parameters. It has the ability to validate upgrades to a handful of the contracts that are upgradable. Not all the NuCypher network contracts are upgradable if you are not, but for the ones that are, those are sort of owned by the DAO, and changes can be proposed by to any of those contracts, or upgrades or security fixes, or anything can be proposed by a member of the DAO and then validated by the rest of the members of the DAO.
That makes sense. And so how does the DAO work? Is it a one token, one vote model? Is it a representative model? Or who's a member of the DAO? How do you think that will be set up?
So it's basically one staked token, one vote. So if you're just passively holding the token in your wallet, you're not staking it, you're not running a node, you do not currently have the ability to participate in the DAO. You have to be an active staker. And then we leverage Aragon's agent technology for the DAO. And basically, Tuck's may be able to go into a little bit more detail on the technical details, or certainly David on our team has spent a ton of time on this front. But basically, there's a proposal period where anyone who is a member of the DAO or a staker can make a proposal. Then there's a public sort of validation period where other stakers can decide whether to approve or reject or not a particular proposal.
Okay, so it sounds like you're using some of the Aragon tools for your governance. How's that experience been? Have you been able to pick and choose? Is it sort of adopted wholesale, or what parts of that have you found interesting so far?
Yeah, so we're specifically using their agent technology. So like there's not currently in the NuCypher DAO, there's not any kind of like decentralized treasury or thing like that. It's exclusively like sort of acting as a sort of ownership mechanism over the contracts. So control contract upgrades and parameter changes. And we had to make a few changes to sort of the agent out of the box. So I believe that out of the box, the agent model is one token, one vote. And so we had to make some changes so that it was one staker, or one staked token, one vote. So that small tweak.
Okay, great. That makes sense. And so we mentioned a few of the sort of types of people or parties that might be involved in the NuCypher network. So we talked about people who might run nodes. We talked about people that might own the token, they might stake the token. Are there any other parties, or are there other sort of groups of people that will be involved in this network?
Sure. So I think like the main, the main sort of, well, I guess it's actually useful, like internally at NuCypher, we try to use as much as possible the sort of traditional cryptographic narrative of Alice and Bob. So in the NuCypher network, there are Alices and there are Bobs, and those are like those are the users of the network. Those are the people that would issue policies out to the network. They would pay for policies, and they would sort of consume these threshold cryptography services. And then we've also introduced this third character, which we call Ursula, and Ursula is one of the nodes in the network. So those the Ursulas are equivalent to stakers. They're the ones that are the nodes in the actual network. They're the ones that are performing the services, and Alice and Bob are sort of the participants in the network who are consuming the services.
Okay, and but the main point is related to the DAO. I guess specifically the people who own and stake the token are the people who will be represented in the DAO.
That's right. Yep.
In our terminology, that would be Ursula. The people who usually run the nodes.
Yep. And that will be Figment. We're planning to run nodes, so we're excited about that. So just a quick plug for us. You'll see us there. and we're excited and we're following along closely. Okay, that makes sense about the DAO. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I'd summarize it is this is sort of the approach from NuCypher towards governance, towards iterating the network, towards keeping things in balance, changing things as we go, and it will be a sort of a one token or one stake token, one vote model using Aragon's agent technology.
Yep, that's a good summary.
Yep. Right. That makes sense. Okay. And so that sort of begets the question of a little bit of talk about tokens. So we're not going to talk about selling tokens or prices or anything like that, but I want to talk about one of the biggest challenges we see in projects, which is how to get your token distributed. Of course, most people lived through the ICO model and saw the good and bad things about that. And it seems like you're doing something novel, and you talked about it a bit, but it seems like we're sort of on the eve of what you call the WorkLock. It's sort of started, and we're going to keep going with it. Do you want to just do a quick description of what is the WorkLock and what is the opportunity for people right now with the WorkLock?
Sure. So the WorkLock is basically our sort of public node or token distribution mechanism. So you notice I called it like our node distribution mechanism rather than just token distribution. And the reason is that, obviously the thing that's most important for the success of the network is that obviously we need a lot of these Ursulas out there in the wild running these nodes and actually performing the threshold cryptography service. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how to ensure that out of the gate there would be a robust set of high quality nodes in the network. And we looked at a lot of the other ways people have launched networks, obviously ICOs, IEOs, airdrops, and it didn't really feel like any of those were really a especially effective mechanism to bootstrap a bunch of nodes for a new proof of stake network. And so we were very interested in a couple sort of design goals. One, we wanted whatever we did to be permissionless. So we didn't want, to basically us as a core development team to have basically pick and choose who gets to run nodes in the network. We wanted it to be open. So anyone that had sort of the technical acumen to stake and run a node could actually do so without sort of us being some kind of gatekeeper. We also wanted to, whatever distribution mechanism we use, we wanted it to preference the right types of holders and the right types of network participants. In this case, obviously, the people that will take the token and stake it and actually run a node, rather than people that are just looking to participate in an ICO and immediately flip it, on a secondary market for a quick return. And we wanted it to be sort of a fair or sort of good entry point for a lot of early sort of network participants. So we didn't want it to be the case where we were out here selling tokens at an extremely inflated price, and then obviously the token price collapses a lot of the sort of 2017 2018 vintage of ICOs where all their communities are extremely underwater. So we wanted it to be sort of a meritocratic way for people to earn tokens by providing this useful service to the network rather than just buying tokens. And actually one of the more interesting sort of models that we saw was from a project called LivePeer. And they had done something called the Merkle mine, which sort of ticked a lot of these boxes. So it was permissionless, anyone could do it. But basically what the Merkle mine did was anyone could create something called a Merkle proof and then basically submit that to the blockchain in exchange for LivePeer tokens. And so we took that model and then tried to adapt it so that instead of this sort of arbitrary Merkle proof, you would actually, the work that you have to do would be actually running a node on the network. So something that would actually be a useful service to bootstrap the project. And so it largely kind of was inspired by this Merkle mine, but hopefully, improved or adapted for our particular needs.
Yep, that makes sense. And so from a technical perspective, what you done with the WorkLock, do you imagine someone else could sort of take it and repurpose it, or is this really specific to NuCypher, do you think, from either the smart contracts or however you implemented it?
I think it's a very interesting way for other projects, not just NuCypher, to distribute, to sort of bootstrap a new network. I know that there are several projects that have done either have done similar things or are looking at doing similar things. Like Edgeware did something called a lock drop, which was somewhat similar, except without obviously like the node running requirement. I believe Keep is either currently doing or is going to do something called stake drop, which I think is more or less the same type of thing as the WorkLock, where they're allowing people to essentially escrow ETH and then run a node in exchange in order to earn these tokens. And I know there are several other projects that have asked us sort of for what our learnings are from having gone through or about halfway through the WorkLock now. And I know that they're considering doing similar things, but I won't sort of front run any announcements from those folks.
Sure. This is a little bit maybe off topic, but I'm curious. Given where you are today, let's say you're starting NuCypher today, would you look at things like launching your token on an automated market maker like Uniswap, or would you pursue a model like this? It seems like you really designing for a sort of maximum alignment of like the people that are going to have our token almost have to work in the network to get it. Do you think that there's any value in these other approaches that we've seen, these sort of more permissionless ways to launch a token?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are definitely interesting. I think like for NuCypher, if we were starting from scratch today, I don't think that we would look at like an initial like DEX offering.
Right.
I think in practice, like it's sort of permissionless, which is nice, but in practice, it's not radically different from just like doing a traditional ICO or an IEO. You're just using an automated market maker instead of selling the tokens directly. And in our case, it was very important that we had not just the permissionless aspect, but also the aspect of sort of having the right types of participants and bootstrapping the network of nodes, and not just sort of a permissionless way to participate, but actually getting sort of the right types of participants into the network as well. Okay.
And so I want to, at a high level, kind of go through the steps of what it would take to participate in the WorkLock. So let's say I have some ETH today, and I'd like to have some new tokens in the future. What are the high level steps I need to do, and what sort of tools do I need to do that?
Tux, you want to take this one?
Sure, yeah. So some of there's actually just two primary steps. You have some ETH and you want to get some new. So right now, you can participate in the WorkLock. There's several places you can do that. So you can do that through Etherscan. You can do that through one of our community UIs, which are great tools. And you can also do this through our CLI applications, which I think is probably the most documented way for us. So if you have your ETH, you escrow your ETH into the WorkLock. Then we wait until the end of it. So that ends on the 28th today. Or I'm sorry, the 28th of this month. And so at the end of that date, we're going to deploy the contracts for the rest of the network, and then we're going to launch our nodes. So at that time, what will happen is you'll get this new token that is then staked or stake locked. And then so what you're going to do is to get the ETH back, as well as the new tokens that you are going to be given for your escrow. You'll run a node for at least 6 months. And then at the end of the 6 months, you'll be given that new token, as well as all the inflation rewards that you were running the node for. So that's probably the best way to acquire new right now. But yeah, so that's probably we also have another way. So if you don't want to run a node right now, you can go through CoinList. We've partnered with CoinList to offer a service for those people. And what CoinList is doing is they'll be running nodes for you.
Okay, that makes sense. And so one thing you mentioned was the concept of a stake locked token. What are the properties of a stake locked token? Is it you just can't transfer it, or what sort of restrictions come with that?
Yeah, so the stake locked token is as I said, it's staked, but it's locked. So it's not liquid. You can't move it around. You're essentially saying this is locked for this duration of time, and I'm going to run a node for this amount of time. And of which, after that duration of time, I'll be able to unlock those tokens, and then they will be liquid again. In which you can decide whether or not you want to lock them back again, or if you want to, trade them somewhere else. So all while this is happening, you're also earning inflation rewards, which you can also choose to put back and add to that staked amount of token, so you can get more inflation rewards. So that's how that works. Yep.
Okay, that makes sense. So is a high level way to think about it is after the work lock finishes, I'll get this sort of restricted token, which has a timer on it. And as long as I stake it and sort of run down the timer, then it will sort of be liquid or unrestricted new token.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't point out as well, or make clear, was that you also get the ETH back as well.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Great. This all makes sense to me. And so this seems like one of the big steps sort of on the road to mainnet. You mentioned there's a few other things along the way as well. What are the other major milestones that need to be ticked off before you can sort of plant your flag in the ground and say NuCypher is launched, mainnet, here we go? What other big sort of steps you need to coordinate along the way?
Sure. So where we are right now is we're a little bit over halfway through the work lock escrow period. So that started at the beginning of this month, and as Tuck said, it lasts until September 28th. And then once the escrow window is closed, there's a 2-day cancellation window where if people decide, oh, actually, I don't want to run a node or I don't want to participate, you have sort of this sort of last chance to basically back out and cancel and get your escrowed ETH back immediately.
Yep.
After that 2-day cancellation period, basically we estimate that the network will launch on mainnet in October. And once that happens, everyone who participated in the work lock can start to claim their new stakes. So they'll claim their new stake, and then they will bind that new stake to a worker node that's potentially run by someone like Figment Networks or another staking infrastructure provider. And then all basically at that point, the network is fully launched. There are nodes that are running in the wild. People are earning fees paid by users in ETH. People are earning the inflation subsidy, and everything is kind of off to the races there. So we really are kind of like in the last home stretch. It's been sort of a long sort of 3-year journey to get where we are now through many iterations of test nets. But everything is sort of right around the corner.
This makes sense. So maybe this is a place where you might be able to use your experience, your hard-won experience to help other projects. We get asked a lot about what are the main things, how should we structure a testnet program? What should we be testing for? What should we be asking our infrastructure partners and validators or whoever, node runners to do? What have you learned along the way about running testnets? And what would you recommend for someone who's looking at starting testnets in the next quarter?
Sure. So maybe I'll give like a history of what we did to give some context. So we went through probably an iteration about 4 or 5 different test nets. The first test net was just like literally, we finally got one NuCypher node working like on a local laptop, from one of our team members. And then the next iteration was we had a couple sort of internal nodes running that were able to connect to each other without crashing. And then we opened it up to a few sort of close partners. A lot of the staking infrastructure companies, I think, including Figment, in sort of what we called a federated internal testnet. So it wasn't just NuCypher team member nodes that were running, but outside external nodes as well. And there was no token at that point. There was no staking. It was just sort of this, essentially like a whitelist of federated nodes that were allowed to join. And then the next iteration was we introduced the token and the staking component, but just a throwaway testnet token where people had to get a hold of this token through a faucet, stake it, and run a testnet node. And then we, earlier this year, I think back in January or February, we ran an incentivized testnet, which we called Come and Stake It. And basically that was when we really sort of kicked things into high gear. And that was kind of like this really like final kind of stress test before we sort of started transitioning to mainnet. And we did a couple different phases for that. So we broke it down into 4 distinct phases where we had like a specific list of staking and node running related tasks that all the participants would have to complete. And basically we used it. The goal for the incentivized testnet was a couple things. One was to just give all the node stakers and node operators an opportunity to sort of really hone their operations and learn and get used to running NuCypher nodes in sort of a sandbox testnet as opposed to in production on mainnet. So we wanted to move the bulk of sort of this learning and this difficulty to the testnet, so that hopefully like the launch of mainnet will go a lot smoother. We also wanted to use it as a way to give people highly competent node operators a way to earn a stake on the network at launch through kind of like through their own merit and through their own sort of participation on the testnet, rather than they have a bunch of money that they're able to pre-purchase some new tokens.
Right.
So it was much more. I know like some projects have run more like competitive testnets, where like people are essentially competing against other participants. I think we had ours was much. We tried to frame it much more collaboratively and sort of as an educational learning process that was sort of preparation for everyone, and I think it worked quite well. I think ultimately there was over 500 participants who successfully completed all of the 4 phases.
Nice.
And then we also had a technical contribution phase where people could, open PRs to the code base or, contribute tooling to the ecosystem. So there were some awards through that piece as well.
Okay. And I'm curious from a sort of technical implementation perspective, what has been sort of a surprising place where you might have had to spend more time than you would have planned, or what has been maybe more challenging than you originally thought?
Oh, the UX.
Yeah.
Absolutely the UX. And in fact, for the testnet, like one of the most important parts of our testnet, I think, was the UX and watching and asking users how it worked for them and, iterating feedback from that. Because stuff that, as a developer, when you're building these kinds of tools, you see stuff and you're like, oh, yeah, this makes sense for everybody. So you write the documentation, you do everything that you think that you think is fine. Somebody else takes a look at it, they do something wrong, and you're like, oh yeah, that would actually make more sense. So you have to go back and you change those things, and you dial everything in to do different stuff, and then and you can iterate from there. There's two, like, from a technical perspective, there's 2 sides to that coin, right? Like you have the UX stuff that everybody else is doing, and then you have the internal stuff that is like based on like also what you're evaluating at the same time. So there's like a lot of little surprising stuff like that. Specifically with, it kind of deals a lot with the UX of crypto. And, of all the things that I'm like happy to kind of have happened lately is just the high gas prices as of late have been kind of this like activity, like brainstorming for the team where we're like, oh, how do these affect the network? And, how do we, like, how is this going to affect our users and everything? And it's forcing us to look at those things as well now that we didn't have to look at before. And so there's things like that. It's like the edge cases is, I think, mostly all around, all the crypto related stuff. It's like the interacting with the blockchain, and those things are all technically challenging. Unfortunately, still, yeah.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. And so I'm imagining now that we've got to the place where the network has launched, it's running. What will you be looking at as a metric to say that this is being used or not used? Is there a certain sort of KPIs? Is there certain things you're going to look for to say, like, wow, this network's actually providing a lot of value to people? Are there numbers that you guys, or a dashboard you have that you plan to be looking at?
Yeah, so ultimately, like, fees paid into the network by users of the network is going to determine whether the network is successful or not and sustainable long term. So basically what we've done is, like many networks, we built in this sort of inflation subsidy early on in the network's life. So the most likely scenario when Mainnet launches is that the bulk of the incentive for people running nodes is actually coming from this inflation subsidy rather than fees that users are paying in. And over time, that inflation subsidy will basically decay ultimately to 0. And if the network is going to be successful, it will require obviously like the ETH fees actually sort of replace that inflation subsidy. So ultimately, like, there needs to be applications that are using NuCypher that are driving demand to the NuCypher network, and that's pretty much measured by our work orders getting issued to the network. Are these Ursula nodes in the network getting requests for these threshold re-encryption services, and are they getting paid for those services? So ultimately that will come down to, is the NuCypher network a useful and valuable thing for people building applications?
Okay, that makes sense. And so at this point, have you seen other folks in the community who are building on top of NuCypher? Have you seen any sort of representative applications or anything that you can share, either company names or types of projects that you've seen that they're hoping to sort of drive this demand of the network?
Yep. So we've seen a lot of interesting stuff get built on our testnets. So there's actually like we did a hackathon. Well, we've done many hackathons, but one of the hackathons we did was an online hackathon with CoinList. And there were a lot of great projects that came out of that. And I actually will just I put the link to the list of projects in the chat.
Oh, great.
Anyone can scroll through that and get an idea for like the types of applications that can be built using NuCypher. A few sort of representative examples that I think are sort of easy to understand would be like a healthcare application, maybe where you want to store patient medical records on something like IPFS or some other decentralized storage layer. Obviously, like things like medical records and other types of data can be very sensitive, and you don't want to just throw those up on an IPFS node where who knows who has access to that node or who even is controlling that node. So obviously you need that record to be encrypted, which you don't need NuCypher to do. You can just encrypt that in any standard way. Of course, then you run into the problem of like once it's encrypted and stored remotely, how do you actually share that data with some valid recipient? So how do you share it with your doctor, your insurance provider, your hospital, for example? And that's basically the piece that NuCypher can play. So you can use NuCypher to delegate access to that encrypted data. And importantly, you can do that in such a way that the IPFS node or the storage layer never sees the data, and neither does the NuCypher network. So only you, the data owner, and people that you specifically grant access to would be able to see it. So that's, I think, one sort of easy to understand example. People have also built sort of like encrypted Slack or chat applications on the NuCypher testnet. I think in the CoinList link that I put in the chat, there's a few examples of like encrypted decentralized Dropboxes that people have built. So that's like a generic or a generalized use case of the medical records example that I gave. And then I think that a lot of those applications are specific to the first threshold cryptographic primitive that we have on the network, which is proxy re-encryption. But in principle, the network is optimized for any type of threshold cryptographic primitive. So, people were to deploy Shamir secret sharing or threshold signatures or distributed key generation or all these sort of fancy threshold primitives onto the network, that could potentially also open up a lot of other use cases.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that in terms of these other cryptographic primitives you might want to see launch. How do you think that will evolve? Do you imagine that there will be another party come in, something the core team does, something that sort of the DAO votes for, or how do you imagine the network will evolve in the future?
Ostensibly, there isn't much required of, we can use the DAO. Like one of the cool things about the DAO is that we can use it to gauge community interest in certain things. So it makes sense for us as a core development team to ask the community and say, is this something that would be really cool? And then in which case they can vote and say, yeah, we might be interested in seeing development efforts go towards that or something like that. Besides that, so we have we're working on some other primitives as well. One of those, obviously is like threshold signatures are very important. For I think the upcoming ETH2 space, as well as like newer projects like Renbeat, and Keep and all these networks that are popping up are using threshold signatures, as well as like some more simple components like Shamir secret sharing. And so we're working on pretty much all of that. Like we're trying to find interesting tech that we can apply and we can easily just drop into the network. And once we do that, then it will be sufficiently general enough.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. If you're up for it, I'd like to sort of run through what the user experience might be for someone who's using one of these hypothetical services, like the private Dropbox, let's say. So there's let me lay out a scenario and see if I get it right, and if so, we can kind of quickly walk through it. But let's say there's a new company called Private Box. They have private storage. I'm a consumer. I pay Private Box in fiat or something, and then Private Box pays. What's the sort of flow of payments, tokens? How do you think that will sort of flow? If you can see all the way up to sort of the sort of consumer layer, someone who's going to be using a developer is using your platform.
Sure. So I'll just use sort of one of the CoinList applications. Yep. Not CoinList hackathon as an example. I think it was called NuBox. And so a lot of the complexity of the network itself is sort of obfuscated to, or should be, I think, in my opinion, for a successful application, end user application, should be obfuscated to the end user. So they don't even need to necessarily be aware that sort of NuCypher is what's powering things under the hood. I think in the case of NuBox, so the one piece that kind of they do have to, at least right now, and maybe in the future, we'll come up with interesting ways to kind of improve this UX. But right now, end users have to pay the network for the service, and that's done in ETH. So I think in the NuBox example, it was there was like a MetaMask or Web3 wallet integration where they made sort of the MetaMask aware of the NuCypher network and able to issue policies, sharing policies to the NuCypher network through MetaMask, along with sort of the required payment piece. So an end user would go to the NuBox website. They would log into MetaMask, connect their MetaMask account to that website, and then they'd have like a UI that is very sort of standard, sort of Dropbox style UI, where they can create folders and directories and upload files, and also share files. And if they wanted to share a file, that would prompt like a MetaMask pop up, say, okay, I want to issue a sharing policy to the NuCypher network, and it will cost X amount of ETH. And they'd have to broadcast that transaction through MetaMask, and if that was successful, then the sharing policy would get issued out to the NuCypher network. And then on the other end, the person that they shared that data with, in this case, the person who's sharing the data already paid, so the recipient doesn't have to pay again. So I don't think that even for NuBox, I don't think they even needed a MetaMask account necessarily. They just had to have some key pair that they could use to decrypt the data that got shared with them, and that would be just done through a standard sort of web UI style experience. Okay,
that makes sense. One of the things that I'm really excited about is this phase of crypto seems to be, there's a number of projects going after privacy and taking different approaches to it. I think I have a pretty good understanding so far of sort of your approach to it. Someone asked in the chat here, what's the difference between NuCypher and Doc? We've seen other ones coming out. I'm curious, is how do you see that the privacy space evolves? Do you think that there'll be a sort of merging? Do you think there'll be sort of people have their own specific use cases? Do you have any vision about how the different sort of solutions that are emerging right now either play together or compete?
Tux, you probably have a lot of things to say on this front.
Yeah, so I honestly, I've been trying to think a little bit about where privacy is going to go in the blockchain space, and it's difficult because there's a lot of stuff that's really specific around financial privacy right now, and NuCypher isn't as focused on financial privacy, and who knows what may be in the future for the network, because not excluding that we can't do that, but right now we're focused on data privacy and user privacy and things like that. So I'm honestly not really sure where that's going to go. We obviously see projects like Ren or Keep, that are working on security for these funds using threshold signatures to, ensure that stuff, goes smoothly between both blockchains, right? Where, if you're Keep, you're going from Bitcoin to Ethereum and whatnot. So for privacy stuff related to like, stuff like Tornado Cash with like snarks and things like that, I honestly see it as like a race for adoption and who gets the most users first. So the problem with stuff like Zcash and snarks in general for financial tooling like that is that they don't have enough users. And if you don't have enough users, then and nobody's transacting in like the secure part, which is the shielded addresses or whatever. If nobody's doing that, your privacy is kind of the moment you exit, it becomes traceable again. Which to interact with Ethereum, you have to exit in the first place. So, that's one of the difficult parts about building privacy tooling and stuff like that for finance. Other than that, it's interesting that I see that there are plenty of people who have needs in data privacy for decentralized applications. And they're always trying to find ways that make it seamless for their users. And of those things, proxy re-encryption, among other primitives, are one of the few that actually keep it seamless. So that's what excites me about privacy, is actually just seeing who gets this adoption, who we're competing with, and exactly what protocols decide to use ultimately. And right now, you know, ever since 2017, kind of died down. A lot of these protocols have kind of been on the downslope a bit, but you know, NuCypher has kind of stayed strong, and you know, because we're builders, we've been building a lot.
Right.
So I kind of think right now that we're going to see a bigger surge in like protocol level privacy primitives, and I think that there's more to come. So that's what I kind of see happening, is that it's not quite there yet, but we'll see it. We'll see a lot more coming in the coming years.
That makes sense. And in terms of adoption, as a core team, are there things that you can do or maybe could plan to do to sort of drive adoption? Or do you think that's something that's sort of outside of the scope of the core team?
You know, the stuff that I think that the core team can do is certainly listen to what people outside the core team want to do. You know, it's really easy to get caught up in constantly looking at like, oh, this would be cool to do stuff. This would be cool to throw in. But what's important is that you have to look what other people need. And because we're a core team, we can add those primitives in. So for example, something like threshold signatures is clearly the one that we're like, this right here is something that people want to use. This is something that people need to use for some security. And we can do that. We can offer that. And that's something that I think that's really great about NuCypher, is that our team is so willing to do that. So listen, as well as, you know, foster the growth as well, and provide support.
I think one of the most important things for adoption is just, given it is a piece of middleware developer tool, ultimately is just making the UX for developers as smooth as possible, so that it's easy for them to build applications. And I think we've gone, you know, we've done as much as we can to sort of make that the case. So that, you know, hopefully there's as little sort of obstacles or hurdles to actually getting an app deployed using NuCypher as possible.
Right. Hackathons help with it a little bit to some degree.
Yep, that makes sense. Okay, that'll make sense. I have a question that's not about NuCypher, but about maybe other things you see. So you've been builders in the space for quite a while. What projects are you excited about, or sort of what themes are you tracking? Seems like you're sort of early adopters. You're folks that are looking out into the future. What are you personally watching in the space?
Yeah, I think so. For me and probably a lot of the other NuCypher team members, like, we are very interested in cryptography, privacy preserving cryptography. So like the things that get us really excited are obviously proxy re-encryption, these other threshold cryptographic primitives that we talked about today on the call, fully homomorphic encryption, SMPC, these more sort of futuristic protocols that might you know, be realized in the future. Those, I think, those types of technologies and projects that are working on those sorts of technologies are probably like ones that would catch our eye and be very interesting. And then like obviously like the whole DeFi yield farming craze is going crazy right now. I don't know that we'll see how long that lasts. I think it's been kind of interesting to watch from afar. I am glad that we're not in the middle of it. Since I can imagine it would be hard to sort of keep your head down and just build if you were sort of in the middle of all of that. But it's definitely you know, it's hard not to notice.
How about you, Tux? Anything that you're watching or sort of favorite projects people think are getting it right?
Well, to just kind of echo Maclane here, you know, both those answers are great. Obviously, as a cryptography engineer, the main like core of all my interest is in cryptography. So I'm constantly hanging out in like cryptography chats, you know, always reading new papers, just find like new primitives, something that like piques my interest enough that I can be like, oh, I can do this thing and that thing and see what happens. And I'm always playing with stuff like that. Other than that, you know, I also echoing some of the DeFi stuff. Some of the DeFi stuff is really interesting. You know, like right now what we're seeing, I think, is like, obviously, like, you know, there's like that loud minority thing. And like, I think actually very few of like what is like the core components of like what makes up DeFi. It's like a very few people, right? Like there's DeFi builders who are building stuff and innovating in like this decentralized finance, whatever you want to put under that category. And then there's people who take that, you know, copy it, add a bunch of stuff onto it and be like, oh, look, we did this thing. And, you know, it gets a ton of clout, gets a ton of money. And, you know, it makes everybody pay much more in gas fees, so it gets the miners rich. But other than, like, what I think is really interesting about that is there's, like, that very niche category of people who are building a decentralized finance scene that are working on that. You know, effectively what they're doing is making it easier to get money from A to B, just like what Bitcoin did in 2000. Or in the late 2000s, you know, when it first came out, it's like, I want to just get money from person A to person B. And what DeFi is trying to do is replicate these traditional finance tools and do the exact same thing. And it didn't really occur to me until, you know, maybe a few weeks ago that is like what the core of it is. It's not just a bunch of people trying to get rich quick and be, you know, just get stupid rich all of a sudden overnight. There's some of that, but to me, that's actually also what's interesting. And anywhere that I can take cryptography, novel cryptographic primitives, and see how they can, you know, make that better, make it more efficient. That is where I'm interested in. And I think we have yet to see anything in that space, because right now it's all on chain. And we don't know what's going to happen off chain yet. That has yet to come.
Yep, great. That's very cool. Okay, so we're almost out of time. To recap, we talked a bit about the DAO, the role of the DAO, and how that's going to evolve. We talked a bit about the WorkLock. The time to participate is now. You still have a couple weeks left to do it. And we talked about sort of the steps to mainnet, and then sort of launch and what life looks like after launch, and what some of the applications might be built. I hadn't seen that list all put together from the CoinList Hackathon, so that's great. I think that will definitely get people's imagination running. So I'm glad to see all that in just one place. So before we sort of wrap up, is there anything we haven't touched on today? Anything you want to leave as sort of parting thoughts to either speak to the developers thinking about NuCypher, the people thinking about the WorkLock? Anything extra you want to say that we haven't covered yet?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess if you are interested in NuCypher, whether it's running a node on the network or building an application that uses the network or participating in WorkLock, I think the first place to go is to our Discord channel. So we do all of our developments in the open and public, so that's where most of our team is hanging out. And it's easiest to get a hold of us there if you want help building something or, you know, configuring your node or connecting to the network. For people who are interested in participating in WorkLock, I would strongly recommend trying out a testnet node first, just so you get a handle on, you know, what it entails to run a node, whether you want to run that node yourself or potentially use an infrastructure provider like Figment to do that on your behalf. The nice thing about the WorkLock is that there is no advantage to participating earlier rather than later. So we would recommend that you just take the time to understand sort of what it means to run a node and, you know, how to actually participate on the network in terms of providing these services. Once you're in our Discord, you can probably find our docs, which is docs.nucypher.com, which has all the steps to getting testnet tokens and installing a testnet node and connecting to the testnet.
Great. Tux, any sort of closing thoughts from you? Anything else you want to make sure we touch on?
Just echo what Maclane said, as well as, you know, if you have any ideas for how to use NuCypher, we love to hear those. And the best place to talk to us about that is our Discord. So if you have questions about, you know, how to use proxy re-encryption or, you know, some of our other things that we've been working on, we love to hear about it. And we definitely want to hear your use cases so we can talk to you, work with you, and, you know, try to figure out something so that we can get you onto the network and using it.
Great. Well, I think we'll stop there. We'll wrap up. So thanks for your time today, Maclane. Thanks, Tux. We look forward to seeing the WorkLock wrap up and the network launch. So we'll be standing by.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
All right. See ya.
Thank you.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.